I hadn't meant to wander off. My road trip had taken me through countless small towns, and this one was just another stop on a map. But something about the little stone chapel caught my attention. It sat on a hill, tucked between overgrown hedges, with its doors secured by a thick, rusted chain and a heavy padlock. A weathered sign hung crookedly above the entrance. "Do not enter. Services suspended indefinitely." As I got closer, I heard it. A soft humming floated through the cracks in the thick wooden door, a tune so faint it could have been a trick of the wind. But no, it was distinct, melodic even. Someone was inside. I knocked once, more out of curiosity than expectation. The humming stopped immediately, replaced by silence so thick it felt oppressive. Then came a man's voice, muffled but clear enough to make my skin crawl. "Help me," he said. It wasn't a plea, it was a demand. My pulse quickened as I circled the chapel, finding a small side window partially obscured by vines. It wasn't locked, just latched loosely from the inside. I pried it open and climbed through, landing ungracefully on the cold stone floor. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying the scent of damp stone and something faintly metallic. The dim light filtering through the stained glass painted the walls in warped hues of red and gold. The humming was gone, and the chapel was silent except for the sound of my breathing. The space was barren except for the altar at the far end. It was a simple wooden structure, but something on it caught my eye, a large, open book resting in the center. The pages were filled with rows of neatly handwritten names. I approached cautiously, each step echoing louder than the last. When I got close enough to read it, my stomach dropped. There was my name, scrawled in fresh ink as if someone had been waiting for me. Below was a blank line. As I stared, the ink on the blank line began to form, each letter etching itself into the page with an unnatural precision. "Welcome, next arrival." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the uneven stone floor. My breath hitched as I scanned the room, looking for the source of the voice I'd heard outside. But the chapel was empty. The walls seemed to press inward, the stained glass casting shadows that twisted and stretched unnaturally. I turned toward the window I'd climbed through, desperate to leave. But as I approached, the window slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire frame. The heavy wooden door creaked loudly, as though daring me to try it. That's when I saw her. A woman stood just outside the window, her face partially obscured by the shadows of the vines. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "The last one didn't make it out." Her eyes locked onto mine, and I froze. She tilted her head, her voice dropping lower. "You won't either." I ran to the door and yanked at the chain, but it didn't budge. The padlock felt cold under my hands, its surface slick as though it had been freshly oiled. Behind me, the humming started again, louder now, filling the chapel with its eerie melody. I turned back to the altar. The book's pages flipped violently, as though caught in a windstorm, though the air inside the chapel was still. The blank line beneath my name filled again, this time with a single word, "Stay." The woman outside the window was gone. The humming grew louder, oppressive, filling my ears until I thought my head would split. I dropped to my knees, clutching at the padlock with trembling fingers, and screamed for help. I don't know how I got out. One moment, the door wouldn't budge, and the next I was stumbling onto the overgrown path outside. The humming ceased the instant I crossed the threshold. The chapel stood silent and dark, as if daring me to come back. When I reached the main road, I glanced back one last time. The woman stood in the window again, her expression unreadable. In her hands was the book, its pages fluttering as though alive. I drove through the night, but the weight of the chapel lingers. Sometimes I think I still hear the humming, soft, distant, waiting. The fog was thicker than I'd ever seen, turning the evening into a white, impenetrable wall. I was driving through the mountains, hoping to clear my head after an argument with my partner. When I saw the sign for a scenic overlook, I pulled over. The mist swirled as I stepped out, the chill biting through my jacket. The plaque near the railing was worn and barely legible. I squinted to read it. Beware the drop. Stay behind the rail. It seemed redundant advice, given that the valley below was completely invisible. Still, the eerie quiet of the place felt calming in a strange way. As I walked closer to the edge, something caught my eye, a figure standing just beyond the rail. Their back was turned to me, their outline blurred by the mist. I hesitated, then called out, "Hey, you shouldn't be over there. It's dangerous." The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, my footsteps muffled by the damp earth. "Do you hear me?" I shouted, but still no response. The air seemed heavier, pressing against my chest as I approached. My heart began to race when I noticed their feet. They weren't on the ground. They were dangling, as though the figure were suspended midair. A voice, low and gravelly, whispered near my ear. "Would you like to join them?" I spun around, but no one was there. The mist seemed to close in tighter, the landscape dissolving in a shapeless white. I turned back to the figure, and they were gone. Only the faint sound of something swaying in the breeze remained. Fighting the urge to run, I backed toward my car. The gravel crunched underfoot, each step slower than the last. I told myself I was imagining things, that exhaustion and the dense fog were playing tricks on me. When I reached the car, I froze. The driver's side door was ajar and muddy footprints trailed from the overlook to the seat. My hands trembled as I peered inside. On the dashboard sat a note, the edges damp from the mist. "You almost did." The words were written in jagged, uneven letters, as though the writer had been shaking. My pulse thundered as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. Just the empty overlook and the mist that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't understand. I climbed into the car, locking the doors and turning the ignition. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the trail of footprints leading back to the railing. But something was wrong. They didn't stop at the edge. They continued, impossibly, out into the air. I drove away, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The fog seemed to follow me, clinging to the rearview mirror. Even now, I can't forget that voice or the figure. And sometimes, when the night is quiet enough, I swear I hear something swaying in the breeze. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the track was soothing as I scrolled through my phone, counting the minutes until my stop. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the air thick with that metallic smell all train cars seemed to share. At the next station, the doors slid open with a hiss, and an older man stepped on. Despite the car being nearly empty, he chose the seat directly across from me. He nodded, like we were old acquaintances, though I was certain I'd never seen him before. "Late for you to be riding, isn't it?" he asked, his voice deep and calm. I forced a polite smile. "Yeah, just heading home." He leaned back, studying me in a way that made my skin crawl. "You've taken this train before, haven't you?" "No," I said quickly, too quickly. "First time on this line." He smirked, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. He flipped through the pages, the sound unnervingly loud in the empty car. "Really? Then why do I have your schedule right here?" I stared as he turned the book toward me. Written in neat handwriting were details about my daily life. The time I left my house, my favorite coffee shop, even the exact train I was on now. My chest tightened as panic clawed at my throat. "That's impossible," I whispered. "Who are you?" The man ignored my question, closing the notebook with a deliberate snap. Funny, isn't it? How often our lives follow patterns we don't even notice. Makes it easy for someone like me to observe. I stood abruptly, my heart hammering. The next station was minutes away, but it felt like an eternity. I didn't care where I got off. I just needed to get away from him. But as I moved toward the door, he called out behind me. Running won't change anything. I'll see you again. When the train finally screeched to a stop, I bolted out, not daring to look back. The platform was empty, its flickering lights casting long shadows. I realized too late that it wasn't my station. I'd been too panicked to check the signs. The next train wasn't for another hour. I turned to the benches near the far end of the platform, hoping to sit and collect myself. That's when I saw him, sitting there waiting. The same man, the same smirk, tapping his notebook lightly against his knee. I froze, my legs refusing to move. "How did you?" I began, but the words caught in my throat. He stood slowly, tucking the notebook back into his coat. "It doesn't matter how. What matters is when." I didn't wait for more. I turned and sprinted up the stairs, into the cold night air, my breath visible in the chill. Even now, I avoid that train line. The shortcut through the woods was routine. I'd taken it hundreds of times to shave minutes off my walk home. The evening was calm, the kind of quiet that usually settled my thoughts. But halfway down the trail, I noticed something strange. A bright red backpack lying in the dirt. It was pristine, almost out of place against the worn path and scattered leaves. I hesitated before unzipping it. Inside were a few basic items: a water bottle, snacks, and a folded note. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "If you found this, you're being followed." My pulse quickened as I glanced around. The woods were empty, but the uneasy stillness felt heavier now. I shoved the note back into the backpack and walked faster, my steps crunching against the gravel path. I told myself it was a prank, kids trying to scare hikers, but the nagging feeling in my chest refused to ease. The trail, so familiar in daylight, began to feel wrong. The trees seemed denser, the twists and turns unfamiliar. Then another backpack came into view, this one blue and slightly torn. Inside, another note: "Hurry. They're getting closer." I spun around, scanning the shadows between the trees. There was movement, just a flicker like a branch swaying in the breeze. But the air was still. My throat tightened as I turned back to the trail, walking briskly now, my heart pounding. Every sound felt amplified. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig. It all seemed to follow me. I wanted to run, but feared what might happen if I did. Then I heard it. Footsteps, light but deliberate, keeping pace with mine. I froze, turning sharply, but there was nothing there. Just the empty path behind me. The trail eventually led to the road, its cracked asphalt a welcome sight. Relief washed over me as I waved down a passing car. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, pulled over without hesitation. "You all right?" he asked as I climbed in. "Yeah, just a weird night," I muttered, my voice shaky. As we drove, I glanced into the back seat. My blood ran cold. Sitting there was a red backpack, identical to the one I'd found on the trail. The driver noticed my stare and smiled. "You found it, didn't you?" The air in the car grew stifling. I gripped the door handle, considering whether to jump out. But the man kept driving, his smile never fading. "Not many make it out of those woods," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. When we reached a crossroads, I lied, pointing to the first turn. "You can drop me here." He stopped the car, still smiling as I stepped out. The red backpack remained in the back seat, but his words stayed with me long after he drove away. They always follow. The tunnel loomed ahead, its entrance a dark, yawning mouth. Graffiti scrawled across the crumbling walls warned in sharp letters, "Turn back." No one gets out, but I couldn't. It was a dare, and backing out wasn't an option. My flashlight's beam wavered as I stepped inside, the cold air immediately wrapping around me like a shroud. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, rusted bolts, and abandoned shoes. So many shoes. The sight made my skin crawl, but I pushed forward, telling myself it was just old junk left by other thrill seekers. The sound of my footsteps echoed eerily, swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. About 50 yards in, I spotted something unusual, an old lantern sitting upright in the middle of the tunnel. Its metal frame was coated in grime, but the glass was clean, almost polished. I picked it up, surprised to find it warm, as if recently lit. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence. Then, further down the tunnel, another light flickered. I froze, my flashlight's beam trembling as I aimed it toward the source. A man stood at the far end, holding a similar lantern. His face was obscured by shadows, but he called out in a calm, even tone, "You can't leave yet. You haven't found your spot." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. "What spot?" I called back, my voice echoing weakly. He didn't answer. Instead, he started walking toward me, his lantern swinging in his hand. I backed away, stumbling over the scattered debris. The pile of shoes loomed closer again, and my flashlight illuminated something I hadn't noticed before, a pair of shoes that looked exactly like mine. Panic took over. I turned and sprinted toward the entrance, the man's footsteps now echoing behind me. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the light from the outside growing no closer no matter how fast I ran. The air turned colder, each breath burning in my lungs. The footsteps behind me quickened. "You can't leave," the voice called again, closer now. "Not until you belong here." When I finally saw the faint outline of the tunnel's entrance, I pushed myself harder, adrenaline surging. My foot caught on a loose brick, sending me sprawling to the ground. The flashlight skittered away, plunging me into near-total darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my hands trembling as I grabbed the lantern I dropped. I didn't dare look back, but the footsteps stopped. A low whistle echoed through the tunnel, haunting and rhythmic. When I burst into the open air, the chill followed me, lingering even in the sunlight. I turned back, expecting to see the man at the entrance, but it was empty. Just the graffiti warning anyone else who might dare to enter. It wasn't until I reached home that I noticed my shoes, dirty and scuffed, were mine. They were the ones from the pile, and I haven't stopped hearing that whistle since. Camping alone was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to escape the noise of the city. I'd picked a spot deep in the forest, far from trails and tourists. The first evening passed quietly, the crackling fire and distant rustle of leaves lulling me into calm. But as the second night settled in, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic ringing. At first, I thought it was wind chimes, though it seemed odd in such a remote place. The sound came and went, always from the same direction. Curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed my flashlight, following the soft clang of the bell. The forest grew darker as I moved away from camp. Trees pressed closer together, their gnarled branches blotting out the moonlight. The bell stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so deep it made my ears ring. I swung the flashlight beam across the trees until it landed on a small, tarnished bell hanging from a low branch. Its clapper was tied with string, rendering it silent. Beneath it, a note was nailed to the tree, the handwriting jagged. "Stay still when it rings again." I laughed nervously, the kind of laugh you force out to calm yourself. It had to be a prank, a strange, creepy one, but still a joke. Yet, as I reached out to touch the bell, it chimed on its own, the sound clear and piercing despite the clapper being tied. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The forest seemed to shift around me, shadows stretching unnaturally. Then I saw it, a figure emerging from the trees. They wore a long hooded cloak, their face obscured in darkness. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure said, their voice low and steady. They don't like visitors. I stammered something unintelligible, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure stepped closer, pulling something from their cloak. It was another bell, identical to the one on the tree. They held it out to me, their gloved hands steady. "Take it," they said. "You'll need it." I didn't move. The figure tilted their head, and their tone grew sharper. "If you don't take it, they'll find you." My hand shook as I reached for the bell. The metal felt icy, its weight heavier than it should have been. The figure nodded once before stepping back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The forest felt alive now, every rustle and creak amplified. The bell in my hand chimed softly, though I hadn't moved it. I stumbled back toward my camp, the flashlight flickering as though struggling to keep the dark at bay. When I reached my tent, I saw another note pinned to the flap. "Keep it ringing or they'll come." I haven't slept since. The bell doesn't stop chiming, even when I hold it still. The forest isn't safe, but leaving feels impossible. The shadows have grown closer, and sometimes I see figures watching me just beyond the firelight. I don't think the bell will protect me much longer. The village sat at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods and rocky hills. I arrived at dusk, the air cool and quiet. Every house had a lantern burning in its window, the faint flicker casting eerie shadows. It seemed charming at first, a rustic tradition in an otherwise ordinary place. When I asked the innkeeper about it, she hesitated before saying, "It's for protection." She didn't elaborate, and her tone left no room for more questions. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just a local superstition. That night, I couldn't sleep. The old bed creaked with every movement, and the distant hum of wind felt more like whispers than gusts. Around midnight, I heard it, shuffling footsteps outside my window. I sat up, heart racing, and peered through the curtains. Shadows darted past, too fast to make out clearly, but they were definitely there. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the window. The lantern in the room flickered violently, its flame dimming as if a gust had passed through, though the air was still. A scream tore through the night, distant but chilling, followed by silence. I forced myself to step outside, flashlight shaking in my hand. The village was quiet, the only sound the crackling of lanterns in windows. One house stood dark, its lantern extinguished. I hesitated, then approached, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Inside, the house was in disarray. Furniture overturned, curtains torn, the faint smell of ash lingering. The silence was suffocating. Then my flashlight caught something on the floor, a smear of dirt leading to the back door, as though something had been dragged out. I turned back toward my room, but the shadows outside seemed thicker now, more deliberate. My steps quickened, the flickering light of the my only beacon. Just as I reached the door, a voice behind me whispered, "Your flame's too weak." I spun around, but no one was there. The shadows moved, twisting unnaturally, and the lantern outside the dimmed, sputtering on the brink of going out. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, unintelligible but threatening. Back in my room, I slammed the door and lit another lantern, placing it by the window. The flame danced weakly, as though struggling against an unseen force. I pushed a chair against the door and sat by the window, watching the shadows writhe and pulse just beyond the edge of the light. When dawn finally broke, the whispers ceased and the shadows vanished. I packed my things and left the village without speaking to anyone, the memory of the extinguished lantern haunting me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lanterns were still flickering in every window, their flames fragile against the morning light. I didn't look back again. I don't know what happens when the last flame goes out, and I never want to find out. I stumbled across it during a solitary walk along a secluded beach. The tide was low, exposing jagged rocks and glistening sand. A metal box, battered and covered in strange engravings, lay partially buried near the waterline. It was heavy when I picked it up, and faint ticking sounds came from inside. Curiosity got the better of me. I carried it back to my cabin, a few miles inland, already planning how I'd pry it open. As I walked, the ticking grew fainter, then stopped entirely just as I reached my front door. The silence felt unnatural. The box resisted every attempt to open it. Pliers, a hammer, even a screwdriver made no impact. Frustrated, I set it on the table and examined the engravings more closely. They weren't letters, at least none I recognized. The patterns spiraled inward, almost hypnotic in their precision. Eventually, I forced it open with a chisel. Inside was nothing but a single piece of aged paper folded neatly. I unfolded it, and my stomach knotted at the words scrawled in a sharp, jagged hand. "They'll want it back." A sudden, loud banging on the door made me jump. I froze, clutching the note, my heart pounding. It was late, and no one knew I was here. The banging came again, harder this time, rattling the hinges. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice unsteady. Silence. I peered through the peephole, but the porch was empty. The only sound was the distant crash of waves, muffled by the thick cabin walls. When I finally opened the door, there was nothing outside but damp footprints leading from the beach to my porch. I retreated inside, locking the door and shoving a chair under the handle. The box sat on the table, its open lid mocking me. I grabbed it, intending to throw it back into the ocean, but the weight felt wrong. It was heavier now, as though something unseen had filled it. The ticking started again, louder than before. I dropped the box and the ticking stopped instantly. My cabin felt colder, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. The air seemed to thrum with an unseen energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I carried the box back to the shore, determined to leave it where I found it. But when I reached the spot, the tide had risen, and the beach was unrecognizable. The ticking grew louder, the sound almost desperate, like a heartbeat struggling to continue. I hurled the box into the waves, watching it sink beneath the surface. For a moment, the sound stopped, and the weight on my chest lifted. But as I turned to leave, a note pinned to a nearby rock caught my eye. "Return it to the shore." I haven't been back to the beach since. The cabin feels wrong now, too quiet, too empty. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint ticking beneath the floorboards, growing louder, as though the box is finding its way back to me. I don't think it will stop until I answer. It started as a quiet evening walk, the kind I often took to clear my mind. The air was crisp, the streets empty. But as I turned onto the main road, I saw them, a line of people marching silently down the center of the street. There were no signs, no chants, just the rhythmic sound of their footsteps on the pavement. They all wore identical black cloaks, the hoods pulled low over their faces. Something about their uniformity felt wrong, almost too precise. I stopped at the corner, watching them pass, unsure whether to approach or turn back. Curiosity won out, and I followed at a distance. The marchers moved as though pulled by an unseen force, their steps perfectly synchronized. Not one of them glanced around or broke stride. They turned off the main road, heading toward an old, abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. I crept closer, sticking to the shadows. As the last figure entered the building, the heavy metal doors groaned shut behind them. I waited, expecting to hear voices or movement inside, but there was only silence, the kind that prickles at the back of your neck. I circled the warehouse, searching for a way in. A single window near the back was cracked open, just enough for me to peer inside. The interior was dimly lit by a strange, flickering light. The marchers stood in a perfect circle, facing inward. At the center of the circle was a large, black object, a monolith of sorts, its surface gleaming unnaturally in the faint light. One by one, the marchers reached out and touched it. Each time, the light in the room dimmed, and the figure seemed to vanish, their place in the circle left empty. My breath caught as I realized there were fewer and fewer marchers left. The room seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't describe, and the air around me felt heavier, like it was pressing against my chest. I pulled back from the window, my heart pounding. As I turned to leave, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to see one of the marchers, their hood still obscuring their face. "You've seen enough," they whispered. Their voice was flat, emotionless. I stammered, but they cut me off. "It's your turn now." They pressed something into my hand, a folded piece of fabric. It was a cloak, identical to theirs. My legs trembled as I shook my head, dropping the cloak on the ground. But the marcher didn't react. They simply turned and walked back toward the warehouse, leaving me frozen in place. When I finally found the strength to move, I ran all the way home. My front door was locked, just as I'd left it, but hanging from the handle was the same black cloak. Inside the pocket was a note. "Your march begins tonight. I haven't left my house since." I was halfway through a long drive when I spotted the carnival lights in the distance. They glowed against the dark sky, neon reds and yellows flickering like a promise of life in an otherwise barren stretch of road. I hadn't seen any signs advertising it, and the parking lot was completely empty. Yet the rides were running, the Ferris wheel spinning, the carousel turning. I pulled in, curiosity outweighing caution. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and grease, but there was no sound of laughter, no music. Just the hum of the machinery, steady and unnatural in its rhythm. The ticket booth was abandoned, but a roll of tickets sat neatly on the counter. I hesitated before tearing one off, tucking it into my pocket as I walked toward the carousel. The horses moved up and down, their painted eyes glinting in the artificial light. I reached out to touch one, the wood cool and smooth under my fingers. "Enjoying the view?" a voice said behind me. I spun around. A clown stood there, his makeup perfect, his grin wide and unsettling. He held up a ticket stub with my name written on it in bold, looping letters. "How do you?" I began, but he cut me off with a wave of his hand. "You've won the grand prize," he said. "Come with me." He led me past the empty booths and darkened fun houses to the Ferris wheel. The seats, painted in chipped pastel colors, swayed gently in the breeze. "Go on," he said, motioning to one of the carriages. "I don't think I want to," I replied, my voice cracking. The clown's grin widened, but his eyes remained cold. "You'll get on eventually," he said. His tone was calm, almost kind, but it left no room for argument. "They all do." I took a step back, glancing toward my car. The parking lot seemed further away than I remembered, the carnival stretching endlessly in every direction. I turned and ran, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I reached the lot. But my car wasn't there. In its place was another ride, one I hadn't seen before. A row of empty bumper cars sat motionless under a flickering canopy. The lights above spelled out one last ride in buzzing neon. The clown appeared again, this time holding a clipboard. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his tone mocking. "I don't want your prize," I snapped, backing away. He chuckled, flipping a page on the clipboard. "That's not how it works." The carnival lights dimmed, and the rides began to slow. The Ferris wheel stopped entirely, each seat facing in the same direction, toward me. My name was etched into every car, carved deep into the paint. I don't remember how I got back to the highway. The carnival lights disappeared the moment I reached the road, but I can still hear the hum of machinery at night, faint and persistent. And I know it's only a matter of time before the grand prize finds me again. I'm sorry for any mistakes I've made, and may you all be well.